So we wanted to talk a little bit about this landmark, iconic poem of In a Station of the Metro, Pound's poem. And how can you get that much from this 2-line poem? Technically 3 lines, if you include the title. Is there really that much there?
In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Do you want to read it too?
No, I'm okay. I really want to talk about the wet black bough, though. I mean, I think this is obviously a clear example of parataxis, right? We're not shown what the relationship of these parts is. So what it is that we're doing is trying to figure out and talk about what the world of the poem is. And you'll hear us use this language a lot. It was used a lot for us when we were in graduate school. And this is in part because when we're workshopping and when we're reading poems, we're not trying to impose like our aesthetic preferences on each other's work or on other poets' work. That's, poetry doesn't have one good aesthetic. There's a lot of work that it can be doing and very diverse work.
Yeah, I think the primary questions that we're going to try and work through that we were taught to work through or came already working through are what is the world of the poem, or what world is the poem building? And we ask the poem, not the poet.
Yeah.
So not what is the poet doing, but what is the poem doing?
And Ezra is not here to tell us, and we don't really care. We're talking about the world of this poem as we encounter it as readers with what is given to us.
Mm. Yeah, and then in order to build that world, what work is the poem doing in order to build the world of the poem? And so, like, the very basic thing that we've already mentioned is this is a 2-line poem, 3 if you count the title, which you need to, and it has 2 basic paratactic images. In the station of the metro, the faces appearing, petals on a wet black bough. And those 2 images, side by side, without any grammatical connection or explanation of what those 2 images do together, that is the world of the poem, but then what does that mean? And what work are those 2 images doing next to one another?
The 2 lines of the body of the poem are 2 images themselves. What space are we in?
In the station at a metro.
Yeah, okay. In 1913.
Like, am I right?
Yeah.
Is that too obvious?
Yeah. And it's 1913, so metros are fairly recent innovations that are, you don't find everywhere. We're probably in a larger city. That's still the case. And then the next line, the apparition of these faces in the crowd.
Apparition is such an interesting word I was thinking of because, of course, it does mean an appearance, right? And so these faces appear, so they could be coming out from underground and they appear, but it's such a ghostly word. It really is a word for an apparition is the appearance of like a ghost or a spirit, something that it's not quite concrete. Talk about concrete imagery. An apparition is not quite concrete. Yeah. It disappears. It's otherworldly.
And we're seeing these faces appear out of a crowd. So there is something that's like distinct about them, but they are also still kind of ghostly, right? There's certain faces that are appearing out of the crowd, but they're apparitions.
Yeah, and I almost, every time I read this poem, I almost see them as kind of blurred out features. And I tend to say...
do you think that because of the next line? Or just because of this line? It's so hard to separate it once you have an example of parataxis. No.
I could not tell you because I've read the poem so many times at this point.
I know. Yeah, I don't know. Just with that line alone, like, do we get an emotional quality out of that, or not quite?
The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Well, it's interesting because it's these faces as well. It's not some faces or those faces or a face. It's these faces. And so there's some kind of either possessiveness, right? these faces
that I'm choosing to pick out.
Or these faces that are simply noticeable to me, or maybe there's even wonder. Sometimes you talk about these people or these things, and there's kind of a tone of wonder. But for me, this line is actually kind of emotionally distanced.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
Not lonely, but removed. Yeah.
Yeah, like dull, like the emotions are dulled. And actually that, I think, is impacted by the next line.
Yeah.
Because when I see the petals on the wet black bough, I think of the rain. And I think maybe the blurriness of the faces might be affected by the image of rain. You know, like people through rain, but also that kind of sound, the way that in snow or in rain, there's like a muffled quality. And I do think that the emotional dullness that I feel is a little bit having to do with that sense of rain and wetness outside and the effect it has on the audio quality.
Yeah, I visually want to see like an impressionist work of art, like a Renoir or like Van Gogh or like Monet. Those are all impressionist, right?
Monet and Manet and Renoir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not Van Gogh. But yeah, like there's like a blurring or a wash. There's like a wash over things from the rain a little bit. But yeah, the petals on a wet black bough, this is the part that I get so excited about because students have so many different ways of reading this. Petals on a wet black bough, what kind of tree are you seeing? Are you seeing a tree or are you just seeing the bough? I think this is a question that comes up a lot when I teach this. Like, what kind of tree is it? I see a cherry tree.
I think
it's pink petals and the dark bark.
Strong my sensory images of a wet black bough of a cherry tree.
I don't see a branch that's separate from the cherry tree. That feels too violent. Like, I don't see that. I can't quite justify that reading with what we're given. But are the petals on a bough being like individually scattered from the rain, or are they intact in their blossom?
I think because they're on the bough, I see them detached.
So do I. I'm so glad. No, I'm interested when students have that other reading, but right. I'm like,
I mean, for me, the grammatical syntax of petals, plural,
instead of
on
buds,
a bough.
Yeah.
So they're not on, it's not a bud on a bough, or petals on a flower, or petals on a blossom, or petals on a bloom. It's petals on a bough. To me, that's pretty straightforward. But I also see that blossoms might also be intact. You know, like to me, I see the whole bough.
Right.
I see a close-up of a part of a tree, and so I see this bough. I have a really distinct image that I always come back to reading this. And so I do see various petals in various locations, including maybe on the blossoms, right? So not all the blossoms are gone.
No, it's not some, like, site of destruction.
Right.
Or rain.
Winter, fall.
No.
Right, freeze.
But I do see, like, when you think of those, like a petal on a bough, like a bough being bark and rough, and a petal like being so delicate. Like there's something really, it makes us read those faces in the crowd differently, or not. It enhances the way that we can see those faces.
Well, see, and here's where like the relationship between the two becomes particularly a question, right? Like, what work are those two things doing together? For one, am I seeing one more emotionally or more fuzzy because of the image next, but also like, why the pairing? What work does the poem do in putting faces, which appear in a crowd, next to petals on a wet bough? Like, are the faces, like, for one thing, are they both lighter in color than their context?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing contrast.
Right.
And there's something that's not specified in the faces in the first line of the poem that I'm getting more of an emotional quality from in the second line. Like there's beauty and wonder in those faces that are appearing. There's maybe even vulnerability.
Yeah, like the very delicate nature of a petal. Like it's so delicate that a rain could detach it from its blossom.
Mm-hmm.
And then a bough is by nature maybe a little bit rougher.
Mm-hmm.
And like a blossom could tear just by being on the bough.
Right.
So there is something about a petal that's been detached from its blossom that's much, like much more inherently vulnerable.
But not like it doesn't feel like a tragedy, right? It's not like the end of this life or something like that. It's just like this aesthetic appreciation in some way.
So if the work of the poem is to build this world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the work of this particular poem has built both the image of a metro, faces, the vulnerability of those. Is it the vulnerability of those people or just of the observer of the images, right? Is the emotion more about these faces, these people are vulnerable, or is it more about my experience observing them is one of
or just being
tenderness,
human? I don't know.
I mean, ultimately, why do we care, right? Like, why do we care?
What are the stakes? Like, what is the world, and what are its concerns?
Well, why is this so iconic, and why do we care reading it? Like, why does it affect us emotionally, right? Do you think that?
I mean, I think that it's really easy to read this poem on first glance as like some kind of criticism of industrialization and the workday and our routines and having to take the metro for work and seeing all these crowds spill out, like the city and how dehumanizing sometimes aspects of our lives can be in these sort of in different contexts, but it's not really like there's wonder and beauty that's being found in really simple scenes, and that I don't know, it's refreshing. It's refreshing to not be given a poem that is immoral about this scene, but is an experience of this scene. Yeah.
That's interesting to me because it kind of embodies that idea we talked about at the beginning with the sort of the intellectual and emotional complex, or that kind of sublime immediate experience, is that this is the experience of observing humanity in this daily rush, in its sort of dehumanized crowdedness, but also in its very vulnerability and delicateness.